This place hired only family, no employees,
Oh.
and was therefore allowed to smoke. And they've just announced that they've curtailed indoor smoking. No one knows why.
Oh.
They may have decided they need some employees or something.
All right, so this is Monday, June 8th, 2015, and we are talking to Primary Stages Oral History Project. We are talking to Robert Patrick. Welcome, and and you are the first person we are shooting in Los Angeles, the beautiful city of. Tell us, where are you from?
I was born in Kilgore, Texas, on September 27, 1937. My folks were from farm families in that area, and of course the Depression and the Dust Bowl and the oil drought all hit right about the time of my birth. And my folks became migrant workers, or my father did anyway. Mama had 3 babies to deal with. We lived a lot of places in Texas and Kansas and Louisiana and Colorado. My very first memory is in Colorado. I was 3 and a dog bit me in the nose. And it wouldn't let go, and it was just as tall as I was. I remember walking back to the tent with the dog in front of me, walking backwards. You can see the scars to this day. That's my earliest memory. And if it's of any relevance, I was in Texas when I started school, and they won't let you start school till you've passed your 6th birthday. Well, September 27th is just after school opens. Mother didn't want, I was a bright kid, I was already reading, and Mother didn't want me waiting until I was almost 7 to start school. So she falsified my birth certificate, and in all official records you'll find me born on August 27th, 1937. But I'm not a Virgo, I'm a Libra.
September 27th.
Yes, Libra.
And where did you act in plays? And you went to many schools.
Well, the first time I went to one school for a whole year was my senior year of high school in Roswell, New Mexico. So there wasn't much opportunity to take part in anything. I was the romantic lead in the junior high school operetta in Clovis, New Mexico, Jerry of Jericho Road.
You saw movies, didn't you? Or
The constant, the cultural constant. We were not much churchgoers, so it wasn't church that was the cultural constant, as it was for many of our class. But movies and radio and records in jukeboxes in restaurants. You know, our cars all had radios in them. So radio programs and music and news and movies, especially for me, movies. I guess it was the dramatic bug coming out. Even the tiniest towns, we lived in a town called Grand Prairie, Texas, that tiny little town that had 3 downtown movie theaters. You know, there were, even the tiniest town, so that meant there were at least 5 or 6 new movies opening on Main Street in Grand Prairie, Texas each week. And I saw them all. It didn't matter what they were, you know. So I saw everything from the Z cowboy movies, you know, with Lash LaRue, and right to the very top class dramatic movies with Anne Baxter and Paul Henry and Betty Davis. My favorite movie memory was in Grand Prairie, a sweet and innocent child raised in a Christian home. I went into the Grand Theater one day and saw Maria Montez as good and evil twins in Cobra Woman. And I ran out in between shows and bought tamales from a cart in the street and went back in. I saw every showing of Cobra Woman for the 3 or 4 days it played. And it was like that, you know, these movies would hit out of nowhere. And many years later, you know, in New York, I met screaming queens like me, and we could quote lines from Cobra Woman at each other, or Betty Davis movies, or Betty Grable musicals, you know. So they were the culture, they were the common culture for a lot of us off Broadway, because many of us hadn't been to college, or we'd been like me, I went to what I understand now is a first-rate institution, but back in 1955 it was a tank town college in New Mexico called Eastern New Mexico University that had just recently gone from being a 2-year college to a 4-year college. You know, nobody had no culture anyway. So the movies were what we had in common, and comic books. You know, and there was a lot of pop art came out of the fact that it wasn't the only culture we had, but it was the only common culture we had in New York. We'd get together and discover we didn't know the same books or the same plays, but we did know the same movies and the same comic books and the same pop music.
And you mentioned that radio play. What was the radio?
Well, the radio had lots of plays on it.
Dramatic.
Yeah. Some of them very corny, of course, but it wasn't uncommon for some Broadway play after it ended its run to go on radio, and even in television. When television first hit the Southwest, a bunch of us drama students, almost nobody had TV sets in 1955, but we knew a teacher who did, and like Julie Harris in Jean-Louis the Lark, after it closed its Broadway run, was on TV. And a bunch of us went and stood on tiptoe outside a teacher's window and watched it on his TV set. You know, so we were, there was a book called the Theater Book of the Year that the library got every year, and all of us memorized it. We used to get in quarrels about who were the best actors, of actors we'd never seen: Noel Coward, Alfred Lunt, Lynn Fontanne, John Gielgud. You know, we read all about them in magazines and books, and then acted as if we'd seen them. You know, a lot of us. See, the only reason I go on about myself is I think I'm characteristic of a lot of the people who poured into off-Broadway. I found a sketchbook of mine from college, 1955 or 6. There are 2 drawings from reality in it, 2 sketches of an art gallery in Santa Fe. Everything else is caricatures of movie stars. You know, we paid no attention to the real world around us because it had been so insubstantial in a way. The movies, radio, TV to some extent, that was the real world and the world we related to. I sometimes think one reason that Lanford stood out from the crowd, Lanford Wilson, stood out from the crowd of other playwrights was Lanford, after a few of those plays that were obviously influenced by movies, actually started writing from the real life around him before any of the rest of us did. In plays like Rhymers of Eldridge and Balm in Gilead. Because Lanford's first plays were, am I jumping ahead?
Not at all, no.
Lanford's first plays were all imitations of plays he'd read, you know, the Beckettian or Jean Kerr or Albion, you know, plays about shy boys who caused the death of sexually aggressive women.
You mentioned we drama students. You were at university.
Yes, and I majored in theater because I didn't know what else to major.
For 4 years?
Oh no! I managed 2.5 years. I was utterly unsuited for any sort of communal or group life. Because of our moving around, I never learned to make friends or interact with the group, except in naughty underage sex orgies in pigeon coops in the backyard, you know. And I was not really suited, even within the drama majors, who were a pretty misfit bunch. I stood out as a misfit, and my grades are terrible. I found some exam papers from college the other day. I didn't answer 75% of the questions. I couldn't be bothered. But I did live in the library, reading plays, reading novels, reading books about theater, you know, so I kind of educated myself. And I understand Portales, Eastern New Mexico University, now has excellent student counseling. I correspond with a wonderful man who works there, and they seem to have excellent student counseling now. I'm not putting down the current Eastern New Mexico University. They had never thought of student counseling then. They didn't know what a misfit bunch the late 40s and early 50s had turned out. And we were all crazy as bedbugs, and not really suited for group interaction at all, you know. And I was especially a misfit. Well, I guess we have to get into this. I'm told it was because I was what is called an abused child. I do not know if that's why, but I was especially out of it, a misfit, inassimilable to society as a whole. Daddy got injured. Daddy worked telephone poles. He was a man who climbed telephone poles and repaired them.
Right.
And one day, one fell on him and crushed his legs, and he got to be a mean drunk. Not long after he got out of the service in 45, and life at home was pretty hellish after that. He became physically abusive, but that wasn't uncommon in our class. Anyway, we were all dirt farmers who, after World War II, could afford veteran loans to get real houses. I remember when we got our first real house with real bathrooms, you know, in Grand Prairie, and but Daddy would turn mean when his legs hurt, and he would beat us, but we took it for granted. It all reached, he got more and more sick and more drunk, and life got more and more complicated, and we had to move to Roswell because he was hurt working in a town called Capitan, New Mexico. And Mother and I went there because I was still too small to be left alone. And then he was moved to a hospital in Roswell, which was when we first moved to Roswell. And then he couldn't be moved from there, and Mother sent for my sisters, and she got a job as a waitress. And she went to work one day with a black eye, and the cook, with whom I suppose she was having an affair, said, "Joe, what happened?" She said, "Well, Bob beat me." He said, "Well, did you call the police?" And Mother reported that she replied, "Can I?" Because she didn't know she could. In our class, that kind of thing was so common. And I still remember, I guess it's ironic, Daddy beat me with his crutch till I climbed a tree in our yard. He said, "You're a boy, you're supposed to climb trees." Made me learn to climb a tree. Well, when Daddy had his last big fit and started flailing about with his crutch, I ran out of the motel we were living in and climbed the tree to get away from him. So I remember from the tree watching the police come and take Daddy away. Then Mother married the cook, and life got a little better. She and he bought a restaurant. He was a great cook from Chicago, and they made the best restaurant in New Mexico, in Clovis, New Mexico. And life was pretty good for a while. I don't know how I got onto all that. Oh yeah, I was maybe especially inassimilable because of coming from an abusive home, so people tell me. But in our class, it wasn't uncommon for the fathers to be abusive. Most of the playwrights that I knew at the Chino told similar stories. It was just, you know, a lot of guys a lot of poor men getting out of the service in 45 and getting veteran loans and getting homes and jobs and educations if they wanted them, maybe not dealing with them very well. I don't know if anyone's ever written the great play about all of that. Lanford could have. And sort of did in Lemon Sky. Mm-hmm. And let's see, ask
And
questions.
then going back to college, did you do plays in college? You acted in plays? And
I was cast in the first play, Family Portrait. I played a brother of Jesus who wants a career and is disgraced by my brothers preaching in the streets. And then I was cast in the next two plays in Leeds and dropped out. There's a school paper photo of me in the romantic lead in Sabrina Fair, but I never played it. And even after I dropped out of that, the director cast me in the lead in the next play, which was, I'll remember, a very demanding play, and I dropped out of that. So he got to where he would cast me, but just below me he'd cast the next best actor. Apparently I was acquitted a good actor, but I just wasn't ready to participate in group activity. I had no confidence, and if they'd been doing Noel Coward, I probably would have stayed with it. I was that isolated. Do a play I like and I'll act in it, you know. And I guess arrogant. I guess that's arrogant.
But you must have been reading a lot.
Oh,
this time.
constantly.
And you were reading lots of plays,
Oh,
playwrights.
lots. Oh, lots. I adored the dramatic form. I was especially fond of Coward and of O'Neill, believe it or not. Coward and O'Neill, that's quite a range. And lots of obscure playwrights whose plays were in libraries but nowhere else. And a woman named Jean Kerr. One of the first things that drew me and Lanford together as friends was we both were the only people we knew who worshipped Jean Kerr. Everybody else said Neil Simon was the great comic writer. We couldn't see him for beans. You know, it was Jean Kerr for us. Mary Mary's. It is a masterpiece. We both tried to write it a dozen times. And then one day, a friend of ours was working the candy concession at a second-rate Neil Simon play called Star Spangled Girl, with Dick Benjamin and Connie Stevens and Tony Perkins. No. And he said, you know, we're not doing very good business. You guys want to drop by some afternoon? I'll sneak you in. We said, oh, sure. We were very condescending about Neil Simon. You know, we had both been called the Neil Simons of off Broadway, and we assumed we were much better. So we went and sat in the back row, and we bought. Since we didn't have to buy tickets, we bought candy and Cokes. We disgraced ourselves. We laughed so hard. We spilled chocolate candy and Coke where our friend had to clean it up. And we couldn't stop it. We'd get ourselves composed, and here would come another barrage of irresistible jokes. And we went out saying, my God, and that's a second-rate Neil Simon play. We probably killed ourselves at a good one, but we came up with a new appreciation. That man knew how to make an audience laugh. Whatever else you might say about him, he set out to do that, and he did it. And it's so funny because we came out of it, and across the street, the last time we saw Harvey Milk, he was across the street from Star Spangled Girl putting up the marquee for Tom O'Horgan's production of Hair. Harvey was a factotum of Tom O'Horgan's. That's
Harvey Milk was?
Harvey Milk, yeah.
Huh.
That's all we knew of Harvey. We thought he was an old boyfriend of Tom's, but he was certainly a slave of Tom's. He did doggy work on all Tom's productions. And we came out and he was putting up the marquee for Hair right across from a Neil Simon play, and we said, this is too much. It's too emblematic. Old Broadway is giving way to the new. See, not many people know that Hair started at the Chino. Jerry Ragney was an uptown suit and tie actor. He and Jimmy were in Broadway plays. I think they were in Lion and Winter. You know, they were Broadway actors. Yeah. And I think they were lovers. And I think one or both of them was married and had kids. You know, they weren't, in other words, we thought of them as those unfortunate people who were trapped uptown sort of thing. We were big snobs about off-Broadway, big snobs. But Jerry came down and he was obsessed with the long-haired boys. And it really disturbed him. I guess his values were, you know, in conflict. He would come down and during shows sit in the back room with Joe, lamenting this confusion. And Joe told him, well, come down here, do a show, cast some of them, meet some of them. You know, it's no problem. Well, and so Jerry and Jimmy did. But being from that professional theater world, they took the show to Joe Papp, you know, Equity House, much more approved. Jerry did act one night in one play at the Chino. There was a fire, and it was a play of Jean-Claude Van Natale's. But they just did one night of it, there was a fire.
Say the title again?
War, by Jean-Claude Van Natale.
Oh, Jean-Claude Van Natale.
And they just did one night. And I'm jumping around, aren't I?
It's not a problem.
So anyway, Hair was a product of Joe Chino's advice.
Yeah.
I never got to see it until I hit Broadway. The next to last night of it at the Public Theater, Joe wanted to go see it, so I managed the Chino. And the deal was the next night he would manage and I would go see it. But the next night he said, Bob, it's so beautiful, all those boys and girls. Do you mind if I go see it again? I said, no. So I didn't see it till the replacement cast on Broadway. You know.
Well, let me take you back just a little bit.
Please.
You finished up your 2.5 years at college in Texas. Then what?
New Mexico.
New Mexico, sorry.
It's a mistake people still make.
Yeah. And then what?
Oh, well, Langford Wilson called me Misfit of 1957. I didn't belong anywhere. I was a mess. I hung around home in Roswell. Roswell was home by then. My mother had married yet again. And I got in everybody's way. I was extremely unpleasant. I lived isolated in my back room with record albums and books and magazines and boys from the Air Force Base. And I was acquitted, a real social-minded little young man, because I was so nice to those boys from the Air Base. I was banging them left and right, you know. They loved having a place to stay in town. Anyway, enough of that. Gay Life in Roswell would make a wonderful movie or play. Gay Life in Roswell in the 50s. I must do it sometime. And eventually, I was such a liability to my mother's marriage. You know, here I was, a 20-something-year-old man. I was a medical typist. Mother was a medical secretary, and she got me work as a medical typist. I was supporting myself. I wasn't a financial drain on them. But, you know, there I was, this big, ugly, queer, you know, more queer than homosexual, you know. I was beat up. Just to tell you what America was really like back then. I was beat up in grade school, junior high, and high school, not for being gay, but for carrying too many books and making other people look bad. They didn't know what a queer or homosexual or a fag was, but they knew what a smart aleck was. And I was just too smart aleck for my own good, you know. And so I wound up joining the Air Force. The boy I loved was in the Air Force. And he left me for a captain who had a Cadillac. So I joined the Air Force to be in the same branch of the service as he. Went to join in San Antonio. My brother-in-law was in the Air Force, stationed there. I joined in San Antonio. They were delighted to find me. I apparently had unusually high linguistic ratings. They wanted me to enlist for 8 years instead of 4, so they could train me in Russian and Chinese to be a translator. And this is a career position. Yeah. You know, I would still be in the Air Force heading a squad of translators. Okay, it's fine by me, you know. I was in the same branch of service as Bobby. 2 weeks in, they called me into a funny little hut in the middle of the Air Force Base. Turns out, okay, I'll tell you the whole story. My mother was a medical typist for, among other doctors, the, what do you call the medical doctor, the doctor who would examine a murdered body.
Yes.
Yeah. Mother was Dr. Blau's secretary, among others. There was a body found scattered across half of New Mexico, centered toward Roswell. They brought the pieces in, and Mother typed up the X-ray reports, and they couldn't figure out, 1, how the guy was killed, and 2, who he was. So Mother, who had, like a lot of women, had an eerie fascination with murders, sneaked a look at the X-rays of the skull and said, well, that looks like the gears of an industrial potato masher, because she'd run restaurants. So they checked around and found that the Hotel Roswell had that kind of potato masher, and that indeed the cook there was gay, had been having an affair with a traveling salesman who threatened to reveal their affair, had banged his head into the potato masher and cut him up and scattered his body around. So they caught him. You know, Mother solved a murder. They caught him, and they discovered that the men's room at the Roswell Hotel was a nest of inversion. It was a meeting place for homosexuals. Well, so was everywhere else in Roswell, but they didn't know it. And among those men frequenting it for purposes of inversion were boys from the Air Force Base. So that started a purge of perverts from the Air Force Base in Roswell. And among the guys corralled was Bobby. They found a poem from me in his wallet. They said, who wrote you this love poem? And he said, Bob O'Connor. So I said, where's he? He said, well, he lived in town, but now he's in the Air Force in San Antonio. And so I was called into this hut. And the guy told me, an obviously intelligent man, you know, who hated this job, said, a love poem from you has been found in the wallet of this airman in Roswell. We've got to throw you out. And I said, oh, come on, I'm really looking forward to this. Give me a piece of paper, I'll sign it. I'll tell you I'm a homosexual. I'll tell you everybody I've ever had sex with. I want this job. He said, we can't. He said, every mother in America would blow up if we allowed known homosexuals in the Air Force. He said, there are, of course, he said, the military, of course, has always been a refuge for homosexual males, but you can't be known. So I was put for 8 weeks in an empty barracks, except for me and 4 or 5 other guys who were being thrown out for being gay, called Hedron, right across from 4 jam-full barracks full of guys who were being thrown out because they wet the bed or they were underage or they were untrainable. And they had to hustle them out because there were so many of them. We sat here unattended to for weeks and weeks till they got around to throwing us out. And I was, just bored. I found out the story. I never told Mother that her solving that murder had gotten me kicked out. But I finally went into the office. I said, this is absurd. I'm a trained office worker. You obviously are swamped. For God's sake, put me to work processing these forms. They said, if you ever tell them this, you'd get us thrown out of the service. I said, why would I tell? They had a coffee maker in the office. I was happy. So that was my military service. I got kicked out. Eventually got kicked out.
Did they put you to work in the office?
Oh, yeah.
No,
Yeah.
they did, yeah.
They needed me.
Yeah.
And eventually I got phased out, as they called it, and went back to Roswell and made my family's life hell again for a while. And then I went to stay with friends who graduated from college in Truth or Consequences, New Mexico, and made their lives hell. And I just didn't belong anywhere. And it finally occurred to me, I said, everybody can't be crazy. Maybe you're crazy. So I went to Las Vegas, New Mexico, where the insane asylum is. And I said, I think there must be something wrong with me. Well, if you go there, they have to take you in for 2 weeks for examination. So I had 2 incredibly educational weeks watching how a state insane asylum works. And 2 weeks later, to the second, they kicked me out saying, there's nothing wrong with you, just move to a larger town. Which I had begun to suspect, instead I moved to a smaller town, Santa Fe, where I washed dishes and waited tables. It's the queer city of New Mexico, and I probably would have hung around there doing menial jobs the rest of my life. But the guy I was rooming with got an offer of a job washing dishes at a summer stock theater in Maine, and he didn't want to go, so he sent me. And I had 2 or 3 months of intense, like everywhere I went, they needed me. Washing dishes didn't make up half my time, and they needed help building sets, moving sets, chorus parts, sewing costumes, selling tickets. I learned everything about running a theater. Kenny Bunkport.
Kenny Bunkport.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Bob Courier.
Do you remember what summer that was? What year that was?
61.
61.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Summer of 61. They did.
And was this your first kind of big trip out of the South or the Southern states?
I had been to New York for 2 weeks, summer of 56, but my mother was afraid I couldn't make it. She pretended to be sick and got me home, and I never got back.
So the 2 weeks in the 50s that you went to New York, what was that all about?
I washed dishes. I saw Happy Hunting with Ethel Merman and Mary Mary with the replacement cast, and a play called Nobody Loves an Albatross with Bob Preston, and washed dishes. Bumped into Mike Nichols on the street. Should have picked him up. And then my mother faked sick. She feared for me. Said
She wanted you to come back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And but this time, on the way back from Kennebunkport, I stopped off for a day to see a college friend who was now in New York, and to see Greenwich Village, which I hadn't seen before.
Greenwich Village, 61.
61, September 14th. And in my first half hour, I followed a lighting genius named John P. Dodd into a little place called the Cafe Chino. He was the first long-haired boy I'd ever met. He was selling jewelry on the street, flirted with me over his shoulder. And I followed him into a little dark coffee house called the Cafe Chino. My first half hour on Manhattan.
And your first half hour in Manhattan?
I left my bags at my friend's house, and asked the landlady, how do I get to Greenwich Village? She showed me a subway. I came out in front of the Greenwich Village Theater, which was showing Gone with the Wind. And there was a spiral of yellow and red brick road in front of that theater. And I took the red brick road. I've always said I took the other brick road down 7th Avenue and to Sheridan Square, where I saw Johnny, who was a beautiful boy with hair this long. Of course, I'd never seen, and he obviously was wearing no underwear. So I followed him down the street, and he knew when he got a greenhorn. He told me later, he said, you were the funniest thing that ever followed me into the Cappuccino. And I went in, and two men named Neil Flanagan and Andy Milligan in red and white striped coats, straw hats, and canes were rehearsing a scene from The Importance of Being Earnest. And I thought that was the show. I didn't know coffee houses did shows. Well, they didn't. But Neil and Andy were rehearsing for a scene at a place uptown called the Cubicula. So I sat down, and nobody minded, And I sat there, and eventually the place opened. And Neil and Andy came over, teased me and giggled at me. I was wearing a yellow, what they call a hoodie now. And they both called me Yellowbird for years. And I must have been the greenest thing that ever walked in there. And the waiter picked me up. I started an affair that night with the waiter, a boy named, I'm not going to be able to remember his name, Dennis Corbett, beautiful marble-skinned Irish poet who was the waiter. And the show, as it turned out, was a woman named Phoebe Mooney and a friend doing two woman scenes from Shakespeare. That was the show.
At Chino, then?
Yeah.
The other two guys were rehearsing to go up to the Cubicula.
A place called the Cubicula,
And what happened to the lighting designer that you followed in there? Was he...
He transformed stage lighting in our time.
Oh, right. But I mean, that day.
Oh, I'm afraid the waiter got me. I guess Johnny was running the lights for that show. I could check our sheet of pages. That decided it. I mean, there was never a place so wonderful to walk into out of 1950s America. Believe me. It had little tiny twinkling Christmas tree lights and tinsel. It got even gaudier as years went on. But at that time, it was just unique. You can see a picture of it taken in May 1961 from Time magazine. They were doing Camino Real. Time magazine published an article about shows in Greenwich Village. And the photographer sent me all the photos he took that night. But it was just a little fairyland. Not just in the figurative sense of homosexuality. It was a bunch of people. The reason I told you so much about me is I think I was typical of the people who stumbled into the Chino and found it a refuge. You could be gay, you could be sexual openly, whether you were gay or straight. You could be obsessed with art and nobody beat you up. You can have read Dostoevsky and nobody's going to say you're a smart aleck. And it was very rare in early 60s America, a place where intelligence and sensuality and education and cultivation were respected.